My older brother fired me from Dad's company in front of everyone. He didn't realize Dad had already signed the ownership papers. My brother fired me from our father's own company in the middle of a Monday morning staff meeting, in front of 11 employees, 2 of whom I'd personally trained myself from their very first week on the job. And he did it with a confidence that told me he had absolutely no idea what was already sitting, signed and notarized, in an envelope on our father's desk that very moment. I'll say this plainly before anything else, because I think it's genuinely important, and because I don't want to come off like I was some innocent bystander sitting quietly in all of this. I wasn't easy to manage, not even close. I'll admit that freely. I've always had a hard time taking direction from my brother specifically, not because he's incompetent, he isn't, but because some old, ugly, 13-years-old version of me still resents that he got to be born first and never let me forget it. That resentment made me a difficult employee sometimes, slow to follow instructions I disagreed with, quick to go around him to our father instead of working things out directly. I'm not proud of that. But I also didn't deserve what happened in that meeting, and I think you'll agree once you hear the whole thing. My name's Jake, I'm 31. My father, Frank, built a mid-sized commercial printing company from nothing over almost 40 years, the kind of business most people never think about until they need 10,000 glossy trifold brochures by Friday, but the kind of business that quietly employs 40 people and turns a very healthy profit doing unglamorous, essential work for other businesses. My older brother Todd, 36, had worked there since he was 19, worked his way up through every department, and had been running day-to-day operations as general manager for the last 6 years while Dad slowly stepped back. I came into the business later, at 26, after a few years doing something unrelated that didn't pan out, and Dad brought me in running the sales side, dealing directly with our biggest commercial accounts. I was good at it. I want that on the record too. Whatever else is true about how I handled myself internally, I was genuinely good at my job, and our numbers on the accounts I managed proved it. The tension between Todd and me had been building for a couple of years, mostly over Dad's health. He'd been diagnosed with early-stage Parkinson's about 18 months before any of this, something he kept quiet from most of the staff, but that Todd and I both knew, both watched happen in small increments. A slight tremor here, more fatigue there, days he'd come in for 2 hours instead of a full shift. Todd, understandably, started taking on more. I understood that. What I didn't love was the way Todd started framing that increased responsibility as increased authority over me specifically, in ways Dad had never actually signed off on. Todd started sitting in on my client calls uninvited, started redlining pricing decisions I'd already finalized with clients. Started, more than once, introducing himself to my accounts as the owner, which wasn't even technically true yet, not on paper, but which Todd said often enough that I think he'd started believing it himself before it was real. I brought this up to Dad directly a few times, which Todd hated, correctly identifying it as me going over his head. Dad's response was usually some version of, "Let him lead. He's earned it. Don't make this harder than it needs to be," which frustrated me because it felt like Dad wanted the transition to happen without actually managing the transition himself, leaving Todd and me to work out the boundaries through friction instead of through any clear plan Dad was willing to put in writing. I know now that Dad had actually been working out a plan. I just didn't know it yet, and neither did Todd. The specific incident that triggered everything happened on a Friday, about 3 weeks before the staff meeting. I'd closed a large renewal with one of our biggest clients, a regional grocery chain that did all their weekly circular printing through us, a contract worth enough on its own to keep 2 of our press lines running steadily for the next 3 years. In the process of closing it, I'd agreed to a modest pricing concession, maybe 4% off our standard rate, nothing that damaged our margins meaningfully given the volume, but enough that Todd, when he found out after the fact from the finance department instead of from me directly, was furious I hadn't run it through him first. He caught me in the parking lot at the end of the day, right as I was unlocking my car, and he didn't bother waiting until we were somewhere private. He was loud enough that a couple of the press operators heading to their own cars clearly heard every word, glancing over the way people do when they're trying to look like they're not listening. He told me I needed to remember my actual position in this company before making decisions that size on my own. I told him my actual position was the one that had just kept our biggest account locked in for another 3 years, and that maybe he should be thanking me instead of chewing me out in a parking lot in front of the press crew. He said something about how numbers didn't matter if I couldn't be trusted to follow a process, and I said something back about how maybe the process was the problem if it meant losing a deal waiting on his signature for 3 days. Neither of us was entirely wrong. Neither of us was entirely right either. It just kept escalating, the way these things do, until we'd both said things we didn't fully mean and were too proud to walk back, and we each got in our cars and drove home to families who got to hear the edited, more sympathetic version of the story that night. I found out later that Todd went straight to Dad after that argument and told him, in his version, that I was undermining operations and needed to be reined in formally, on paper, with some kind of documented authority that would let Todd override my pricing decisions going forward. Dad apparently listened, said he'd think about it, and didn't commit to anything on the spot, which Todd took as tacit approval rather than what it actually was, which was Dad quietly deciding something entirely different was needed instead. What none of us knew, what I certainly didn't know, and what I've since confirmed Todd genuinely didn't know either, was that Dad had already been meeting privately, for weeks, with our company's longtime attorney, a man named Mr. Reyes who'd handled Dad's business and personal legal matters for almost 20 years. Dad's Parkinson's diagnosis had apparently pushed him to finally formalize a succession plan he'd been putting off for years, the kind of plan a lot of family business owners avoid because it forces uncomfortable decisions about which kid gets what, decisions that feel like they'll blow up the family no matter how you make them. Dad had decided, according to what Mr. Reyes told me much later, that the fairest structure was a formal ownership transfer that split the company's voting shares between Todd and me equally, 51% total moving to us jointly, with Dad retaining a minority interest and stepping into a chairman-in-name-only role, with Todd remaining general manager for day-to-day operations, but with major decisions, including anything touching personnel. Now requiring both of our sign-off rather than Todd's alone, Dad had signed those ownership papers on a Wednesday. The staff meeting where everything blew up happened the following Monday. Dad wasn't planning to announce it that day. Mr. Reyes told me later that Dad had wanted a quieter, more deliberate rollout, sitting Todd and me down separately first before anything went to the wider staff. But Dad had a doctor's appointment that Monday morning that ran long, which meant he wasn't in the building yet when the meeting started, which meant Todd, still stewing over the parking lot argument 3 weeks earlier, and apparently having decided he'd waited long enough for Dad to handle me, decided to handle it himself. The meeting was a standard Monday production run-through. 11 of us crammed around the conference table with coffee going cold in front of most of us, press operators, our shipping coordinator, a couple of the account managers I worked closely with, people I liked, people who'd been at the company longer than I had and who I genuinely respected. The fluorescent lights in that room always buzzed faintly, just enough that you noticed it in the quiet moments, and I remember noticing it that morning right before everything went sideways, like some small part of my brain was already bracing for something. We were about 15 minutes in, going through the week's job schedule, press run times, a paper shortage affecting one of our vendors, ordinary Monday stuff, when Todd set down his pen with a little more deliberateness than the moment called for and brought up the grocery chain account out of nowhere in front of everyone. He said he wanted to talk about some concerning patterns in how pricing decisions were being made on major accounts lately. I felt my stomach drop immediately because I could tell from the set of his jaw this wasn't going to be the private conversation it should have been, and every instinct I had told me to get us out of that room before it went further. I tried to redirect it, said something like, "Todd, maybe this is a conversation for after the meeting," keeping my voice level, trying to signal without saying it outright that we didn't need to do this here. He cut me off almost before I'd finished the sentence, said no, actually, he thought the team should hear it, because it affected all of them and how accounts got handled going forward. Then, with 11 people watching, most of them now very deliberately looking anywhere but at me, he said that effective immediately, I was being let go from the company. He said he'd discussed it with Dad and it had been decided, said it in that flat, administrative tone people use when they want something to sound already finalized rather than up for discussion. And he told our shipping coordinator to start working on transitioning my accounts to one of the other account managers by end of week, like he was reassigning a printer, not ending someone's job. I want to describe what that actually felt like, because I don't think the word humiliating quite covers the specific texture of it. It was the particular kind of humiliation where you watch people you've worked alongside for years, some of them for as long as I'd been there myself, try to figure out where exactly to look, whether to make eye contact with you or with the table in front of them, whether saying anything at all would make things better or worse for either of you. Nobody moved. Somebody's coffee mug clinked against the table when their hand shook slightly setting it down, and in the silence that followed, that small sound felt enormous. One of the account managers, a woman named Nicole who had trained personally 2 years earlier and who I genuinely respected, actually started to say something. I could see her drawing the breath for it. I think she was going to push back on Todd right there, and then visibly thought better of it, shoulders dropping half an inch, which I understood completely, given what pushing back could have cost her, and which still felt like a small second cut anyway on top of the first one. I didn't argue with Todd in that room. I want to be honest that some of that was pride. I wasn't going to beg for my job in front of 11 people who'd now watched my own brother fire me like I was a problem employee instead of family. But some of it, if I'm honest, was also genuine confusion, because Todd had said Dad had discussed and decided this, and some small part of me, even furious, even humiliated, still half believed him, because why would he lie about something that easy to disprove? I got up, said I'd collect my things, and walked out of that conference room into a bullpen full of people who'd clearly heard at least some of it through the walls. I was standing at my desk, hands shaking slightly as I put a framed photo of my kid into a box I'd grabbed from the supply closet, when Dad walked in the front door, 20 minutes late from his appointment, cane in hand, moving slower than he used to but still very much paying attention to the room. He asked me what was going on. I told him as evenly as I could manage that Todd had just fired me in the staff meeting, that he'd said it was something the two of them had discussed and decided together. Dad's face did something I'd never seen it do before, a kind of stillness that was somehow louder than shouting would have been. He asked me to wait exactly where I was, and he walked, cane and all, directly into the conference room, where Todd was still standing at the front of the room, apparently in the middle of explaining the transition plan to the rest of the staff like it was already settled business. I didn't go in with him, but the conference room had a glass wall facing the bullpen, the kind every open office has now half meant for transparency and half, I've always suspected, meant so management could keep an eye on everyone without leaving their desk. Everyone at their own desks, myself included, box still half-packed in front of me, had a clear line of sight to what happened next, even without hearing every word through the glass. Dad walked to the front of the room, cane tapping against the floor with each step, and stood next to Todd, who from the look on his face had clearly assumed, right up until that exact moment, that Dad's arrival meant reinforcement rather than correction. From what people told me afterward, piecing it together from what carried through the door someone had left cracked, Dad said, calmly but firmly enough that it reached every corner of the room, "Nobody in this room is fired. Nobody. Todd, you and I need to talk, right now, privately, and everyone else please, go back to what you were doing." Nicole told me later that the word nobody landed twice, deliberately, the way a person repeats something when they want to make absolutely sure it's the only thing anyone remembers walking out of that room. Todd's face, watching through that glass, went through something I actually did feel a flicker of sympathy for in the moment, humiliating as my last 20 minutes had been, a kind of confusion curdling fast into dread, the look of a man realizing in real time, in front of the exact same 11 people, that he'd badly misjudged something important. They were in Dad's office for almost 40 minutes. I sat at my desk the entire time, not unpacking the box, not really working, just waiting, while the rest of the staff did their best impression of normal Monday productivity around me, which is to say, badly. Nicole came by at one point and quietly told me she was sorry, that she should have said something in the meeting, and I told her honestly there wasn't anything she could have done that wouldn't have made her own position worse, and I meant it. When Dad finally came out of his office, he asked me to come in. Todd was still there, sitting in one of the chairs across from Dad's desk, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him look, which was strange to witness given he's 6'2", and I've spent my whole life feeling physically dwarfed by him in rooms like this one. Dad sat down slowly behind his desk, set his cane against the edge of it, and told me directly, with Todd sitting right there having to hear it alongside me, about the ownership papers. About the 51% split between the two of us, effective as of that Wednesday's signature. About the joint sign-off requirement on personnel decisions specifically, a clause, Dad said, that Mr. Reyes had actually insisted on including, almost like he'd anticipated exactly this kind of situation happening before it happened. That clause meant, plainly, unambiguously, that Todd had never had the authority to fire me on his own in the first place, regardless of whatever he believed he and Dad had discussed in that hallway conversation 3 weeks earlier. Dad said, looking at Todd more than at me while he said it, that he'd told Todd, after the parking lot incident, only that he'd think about how to handle the pricing disagreement between you two, not that he'd approved a termination, not that any final decision had been reached at all, not even close to it. He said he remembered the conversation clearly, remembered walking away from it, still turning the whole situation over in his head. Todd had apparently heard exactly what he wanted to hear in that ambiguous, unfinished sentence, and had run with it alone, in front of the entire staff, without ever once circling back to confirm it before making it public. Dad didn't raise his voice saying any of this. He didn't need to. I watched Todd's face get smaller with every sentence. Todd didn't argue with any of it in that office. I think some part of him already knew, the moment Dad walked into that conference room with that particular stillness on his face, exactly how badly he'd overstepped. He apologized to me there in the office, stiffly, clearly still working through his own shock more than genuine remorse in that first moment, though I'll say the remorse became more real over the following weeks. What happened after that took a few weeks to fully settle. The ownership transfer, which Dad had wanted to roll out carefully and privately, ended up happening in the most public and chaotic way possible instead, with the entire staff having witnessed at least the edges of the blow-up and inevitably piecing together the rest through office gossip within days. Dad called a second staff meeting, later that same week, and this time handled the announcement himself calmly on his own terms, explaining the new ownership structure, the joint decision-making requirement, and without dwelling on it more than a sentence or two, clarifying plainly that no one had been fired and no one was going to be, walking back Todd's announcement in front of the same 11 people who'd watched it happen in the first place. Todd and I had a real conversation about a month later, away from the office, just the two of us, over beers he'd suggested we get, which surprised me enough that I almost said no out of sheer wariness. We sat outside on a bar patio neither of us had been to before, neutral ground, and for the first 20 minutes we mostly talked about nothing, the way brothers do when they're circling something neither one wants to be the first to bring up. Eventually, he did bring it up. He told me as honestly as I think he's capable of being, that he genuinely convinced himself, somewhere over those 18 months of watching Dad get slower and more tired, that the company was becoming his by default, not through any decision he'd consciously made, but just through sheer accumulation, showing up every single day doing the work Dad no longer could, until the weight of doing it made him start believing he owned it. He said somewhere in that process, he'd stopped seeing me as a full partner in the business at all, and started seeing me instead as an obstacle to be managed, a loose variable he needed to get under control before things could run the way he thought they should run. He said hearing Dad correct him in front of the whole staff, in that exact tone, using the word nobody twice, was, in his own words, the most humiliated I've ever been in my entire life. I told him honestly, without much satisfaction in saying it, that made two of us, just about 20 minutes apart from each other on that same Monday morning. We run the company together now, genuinely together, in a way that took a lot longer to build than the ownership papers themselves did. Signing a document splitting 51% evenly between two brothers took Dad and Mr. Ray's maybe 40 minutes in a lawyer's office. Actually learning to run a business as equals, after years of an unspoken hierarchy that had let one of us assume authority the other never agreed to, took the better part of a year, plenty of it uncomfortable, some of it genuinely ugly before it got better. There are still arguments between us, plenty of them, because we're still brothers who see things differently on plenty of things and always will, about pricing, about hiring, about which press line gets prioritized when two big jobs land the same week. But they happen in Dad's office now, or mine, or Todd's, behind closed doors, worked all the way through before either of us takes anything to the staff, no matter how strongly either of us feels in the moment. We learned that the hard way, in front of 11 witnesses, and neither of us has needed the lesson repeated. Dad still comes in a few days a week, slower than he used to be, leaning on that cane a little more with each passing season, his voice a little quieter than it was even a year ago. But he's sharp as ever about the one thing that mattered most to him in putting all this together, which he told me himself once, months later, sitting in that same office where he'd once said the word nobody twice to make sure it stuck. He said he hadn't drawn up those ownership papers to protect the company from either of us individually, like we were threats to be managed. He'd drawn them up because he could see, more clearly than either of us could see it about ourselves at the time, that without something formal holding the balance between his two sons, one of us was eventually going to try to erase the other without even fully realizing that was what he was doing. He wasn't willing to let that happen to either of us, he said, not even from a hospital waiting room chair he was already quietly spending more time in than either of us knew. That's the last one for this batch. 3 families, 3 rooms full of people watching something break in real time, 3 moments that felt, to the person standing at the center of them, like the absolute final word on who they were to the people who were supposed to love them the most. And 3 reminders, I think, running underneath all of it, that the people who talk the loudest about what's already decided are very often the ones who check the least before saying so out loud, and that it's almost always worth finding out for yourself before you let someone else's version become the whole story.